Du written while traveling at night. Sparse grass, a faint wind along the shore, the tall mast of my solitary boat in the night. Stars hanging low over the flat, wide plains. Moon bobbing up from the great river's waves. How can a man make a name by writing? Old age and illness have ended my career. Drifting, drifting, what am I like? Between heaven and earth, a wind-blown gull. So here we have the ninth of Du Fu's pentasyllabic regulated poems in this anthology. As I've been saying, these poems are generally structured in a chronological order. And if in the previous two ones we heard about departures or deaths of different Du Fu patrons, after the absence of Governor Jian Wu from the area of Shu, Du Fu decided to, continue moving around and looking for a place in which to prosper. Basically, he traveled down from the area of Shu by boat into the Yangtze River. So this poem would have been composed at that time when he has decided to leave Shu and when he goes downriver to the southern area of Chu. So at this time, Du Fu was quite old. He must have been at least in his 60s, I imagine. He was very frail and suffering from many illnesses, rheumatism, malaria. I think he had lost all of his teeth. He was a human ruin, physical ruin at least. Of course, he had lost all hopes of promotion, of serving in office. He had even lost all hopes for literary fame because, he became very popular and respected after his death. But during his lifetime, he wasn't particularly valued and kept in high esteem as Li Bai was, for a contrast. So this is a poem that tells of his journey and his thoughts at this late time of his life. It's probably one of his late poems, one of the last poems he wrote, when he is floating down the Yangtze River and, meditating about what he sees, but also about what his life has been. It's a pretty dark poem. If I'd have to say what's the topic of this poem, I think the main topic is failure, perceived, personal failure. So, quite a dark poem, quite dark images. There's also a description, there's a landscape element in this poem, in the description of what is seen from the boat. But as I said, the main topic is Du Fu as an unsuccessful figure, a drifter, well represented by the final image of the wind-blown gull, a person who has been pushed around by his times, by his bad luck, and a person who has not managed to make a name for himself. How wrong Du Fu was about this opinion does not minimize the pleasure or the aesthetic appreciation of a poem on a sad topic, which would be felt by many poets and would be suffered by many people. Okay then, so as usual, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. So one characteristic that I've read about this poem is that, as sometimes happens with regulated poems, in this one, not only the second and third couplets are parallelistic, the first one is also parallelistic as well. Sparse grass, a faint wind along the shore, the tall mast of my solitary boat in the night. So the title of the poem indicates us that the poet is traveling at night. How is he traveling? Well, the first couplet gives us a little bit more detail. He's traveling by boat. The first line tells us what can be seen from the boat and introduces the fact that we are in a boat by a reference to the shore. Sparse grass, a faint wind along the shore. So on the shore we have grasses, not many, so it's sparse. It's a rather desolate landscape, and there's a faint wind also blowing. The tall mast of my solitary boat in the night, as opposed to this first horizontal image in the first line, the second line, completing the couplet, has a vertical image. The tall mast of the boat is rising vertically into the depths, into the inky depths of the heavens and of night. The solitary boat acts in a way as a synecdoche for the poet himself. He feels solitary, lonely, forlorn. His life is a desolate landscape. So in this first image of the poem of a boat with a high mast, solitary, the adjective used for describe the boat is the key word, because the boat is acting, one feels it is acting as a stand-in for Du Fu himself. The next couplet continues, giving us the landscape, but in a more cosmic manner than the first couplet. Stars hanging low over the flat, wide plains, moon bobbing up from the great river's waves. So if you notice, the images in the second couplet match in a way the images of the first couplet. So the first image is a horizontal image. It puts the emphasis on the wide plains, on the flat, expanding plains next to the river. And the stars are coming, there's a star-studded sky. It's dark, so the stars seem to be touching the plain or landing in the plain. So this descending motion is also contrasted by the other ascending motion of the second line of this couplet. Moon bobbing up from the great river's plains. The stars are hanging down, the moon is floating up. The stars are over a wide plain, the river is climbing the waves of the river. So, you get a very complete set of land and water, heaven and earth, stars and moons, and moon sets of images. But anyway, the images, as I said, seem to continue in a more cosmic vein, the ones of the first couplet. We've got stars and the moon. We've still got the river with its waves and the moon rising, and the stars, like falling over the plain, as it were. So now this begins the second part of the poem in the last two couplets, where we're introduced not to what Du Fu is seeing, but to what Du Fu is feeling. How can a man make a name by writing? Old age and illness have ended my career. So the third couplet summarizes Du Fu's feelings, impressions of himself in a pretty straightforward manner. He says, he asks what seems to be a rhetorical question. Can a person make a name for himself just for writing? Of course, it's a rhetorical question. There are examples that Du Fu knew of poets that became famous for their literary merit, like his friend and admired figure Li Bai. Of course, we can read this as a question related to the difficulty of achieving this and to himself in having failed to achieve that. And the second line seems to hammer the point. Old age and illness have ended my career. So this couplet, summarizes, matches the desolate landscape with the desolate feelings of Du Fu. He says, my life has been a failure. I haven't become a great writer. I haven't been a successful scholar official. I'm old now, I'm ill. And my career, and probably my life, are close to ending. Finally, the last couplet that concludes the poem develops this image of failure through an image. So it develops these ideas of having failed through a very specific, very visual image with a rhetorical question and an answer. Drifting, drifting, what am I like between heaven and earth, a wind-blown gull. Drifting, drifting, remember, you could say it's traveling is a subtopic of this poem. Parting, traveling, not being at the place where you should be, where your roots are. And traveling is generally, almost unanimously, a negative thing in Chinese poetry. It's always represented from the point of view of being far from loved ones, being far from the court, being far from home, family, and from comforts. An obligation, a duty perhaps of a scholar official, but something not to be relished. And Du Fu seems to be rootless. He has been effectively drifting for the last 10, 20 years without a place that he can really call a home. And he asks, what am I like? Between heaven and earth, remember all the images of the skies and of the river and land below that were presented in the previous couplets. Drifting between heaven and earth, Du Fu is a wind-blown gull. He's a bird, a sad bird, crying. His poems, his lines are his cries, floating and being pushed randomly between heaven and earth. So this is Du Fu's poem, and we've talked previously about what is, for me, Du Fu's most famous line, which is, the one about the country, the nation is in ruins, but mountains and rivers remain. But if I had to say which is perhaps my favorite Du Fu poem, or at least definitely the poem that comes to mind when I think of Du Fu, the poem I have in my mind, it's this poem. It's a very sad, desolate poem. I think it profits from translation because it doesn't have too many allusions or quotations from literature. It's quite visual, it has very strong images. It has a very sad and melancholy pathos. So, for me, this is Du Fu's best poem, at least in translation, and therefore the best poem of his that I can access as a person who does not know yet classical Chinese. So, lovely poem, very subdued, very sad, and, a little gem, a little work of art. And not marred in the least by the fact that Du Fu, as I've just said, was greatly mistaken about being a failure. He is the greatest Chinese writer for poems like this.